And it's unclear that Trump has ready a plan that is workable. That is to say, that he knows that Putin is going to be ready to make compromises.
Let's turn then to Ukraine and to the Alaska summit, which is on Friday. President Zelensky has praised Donald Trump's determination to end the war in Ukraine. The US president said accepting new borders might be necessary to reach a ceasefire, but the Ukrainian leaders warned that a renewed Russian offensive could ensue. Yaroslav Trofimov is chief foreign affairs correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. Yaroslav, good afternoon.
Hi, good to be on the show.
It's great to speak to you. There are reports of new Russian pushes. I noted one near Kharkiv. Talk to us about the situation on the ground right now, because I think that is important, obviously, context for the Alaska summit.
I mean, the Russian military has been on the offensive for more than 2 years, all across the front line. I mean, the latest that we've heard was there is a Russian breakthrough on the Pokrovsk front in the Donetsk region. It's not clear how serious it is and how large of a group has infiltrated behind the Ukrainian lines, but we're still not talking about any strategic setbacks. And the Ukrainian military says it's going to be able to tackle this, well, if the coming days will show.
Yaroslav, do stay with us. I want to bring in Charles Kupchan, who is was senior director for the National Security Council under President Obama. Charles, welcome to the conversation.
Good to be with you.
It's great to have you, and Charles and Yaroslav, I'd like to introduce you to one another. Charles, I want to begin there with the context for this meeting on Friday. There's reporting today that President Trump is trying to sort of dial down expectations and sort of manage what we might hope for, I guess, from this summit on Friday. But what is the diplomatic jeopardy, really, of discussing land swaps at this stage, especially when most territory in question does remain under Ukrainian control, it would seem?
Yeah, I mean, my big concern is not the meeting itself. I think in the end of the day, if we're going to get a peace deal in Ukraine, it will require a conversation between Trump and Putin. That having been said, this meeting strikes me as premature because it is a win for Putin. Trump is in some ways ending Putin's isolation. He's letting Putin out of the penalty box. He's meeting with him in the United States, which is a pretty big deal. And it's unclear that Trump has ready a plan that is workable. That is to say, that he knows that Putin is going to be ready to make compromises. And for my money, the key issue is not what's happening in eastern Ukraine. I think if there's a ceasefire in place, maybe there'll be some land swaps here and there. The big question is, what happens to the 80% of Ukraine on the other side of that line that is still free, that is still governed from Kyiv? Unless and until we have a sense that Putin is ready to let the rest of Ukraine go, to be free, to be secure, to be independent, we're not even close to getting a deal.
Yaroslav, what do you make of that?
Well, I agree on all the key points, and I think it's very much true that it's a win-win situation for President Putin. On one hand, if he gets his way on Ukraine from President Trump, great, he can pocket a major achievement. And if he doesn't, well, he has been giving the stage to be an equal great power, deciding the fate of the world, something that Moscow has desired throughout the Cold War and wasn't quite allowed to, really. And so, but the bottom line is that, the Ukrainians are fighting this war against Russia, not the Americans. And as President Zelensky said today, there's nothing that Trump and Putin can agree without us in Alaska, because at the end of the day, all of these agreements will have to be validated by Ukraine and by the Ukrainian people.
Charles, on that, are there any precedents where an excluded party has sort of successfully shaped the outcome of such vital talks as these, or is exclusion usually something of a diplomatic death sentence?
No, I wouldn't say it's a death sentence, and we don't know exactly what the next phase of these conversations are. I'm guessing that Trump is going to get on the phone and call Zelensky as soon as he finishes the meeting with Putin. And we saw really earlier on in Trump's diplomacy, even though it was a bit of a mess with no strategy, that he reached out to the Russians and then he reached out to the Ukrainians and then he talked to the Europeans. So there isn't, I think, a sense that Trump is going over the heads of Ukrainians permanently. And Yaroslav just said the key here, there is no deal if the Ukrainians don't accept the deal. The Ukrainians are the ones that ultimately are going to have to say, yes, we can live with this. We're ready to accept the ceasefire and the terms of the peace settlement that comes next. And my big concern is that we simply have no clear sense that Putin, from the very beginning, has been negotiating in good faith. Not once has he said, I'm ready to back away from my maximalist war aims, which include what he calls the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. What does that mean? It means toppling the government, getting rid of Zelensky, installing some kind of government that would turn Ukraine into a client state. If that's what he's aiming for, this war is going to go on for quite a long time.
Yaroslav, in our coverage, we of course consider the role of the Europeans in all of this, and just I would appreciate your analysis on whether that is evolving as we get closer to the summit in Alaska, but also some input on how other nations around the world may be keeping an eye on this summit. I'm thinking particularly of China, of others around the world watching this summit for kind of cues on how far the US can be pushed when it comes to compromise.
Well, Europe is not one country, obviously, and there are countries in Europe, especially those that are closest to Russia, such as Poland, such as the Nordic states, but even Germany, that see the war in Ukraine as existential to their own security, and that are very much concerned that if Putin is allowed to install a client regime in Ukraine of the kind that already exists in Belarus and to put his forces on the borders of Poland and Hungary and Slovakia, that would be just a prelude to the invasion of the EU, invasion of NATO. And so for them, it's a matter of vital national interest to prevent a capitulation of Ukraine, to prevent Putin from achieving his goals. Obviously, you have China that is watching this conflict very closely, and the Chinese foreign minister was very frank in the recent meeting in Brussels. He said, we don't want Russia to lose this war. We're sort of interested in it going on for a long time, because the moment it ends, the attention of the West will turn on us. And yes, obviously there are other countries like India that is being pressured, was pressured at least before this meeting by the US to stop buying Russian oil. We'll see if if those sanctions will actually be implemented once the deadline comes in later this month.
Yeah. And just a final question as well for you, Charles, if I may, on this. Is there any chance, do you think, that Europe would actually disapprove of any deal that Trump emerges with? I'm trying to get at, I suppose, reports of kind of tension even within European nations as to what Trump seems to be driving at in the Alaska summit, albeit he says it's just a, quote, feel-out meeting with Putin. But actually, will Europe be brought in line? Because if Trump gets a deal, well, it's better than no deal, perhaps?
A bad deal is worse than no deal. And I think the worst case scenario is that Trump goes in there, he cuts a deal over the heads of the Ukrainians and over the heads of the Europeans. It's one that leaves Ukraine a bit of a vassal state, as Yaroslav said, another Belarus. And the Ukrainians just say, there's no way in hell we're going to go with this. And the Europeans back Zelensky. Trump might then say, hey, I've got you the best deal you're ever going to get. It's the best way to stop the killing. If you don't want to sign off on this, that's fine, but I'm going to walk away. And then I think you face a situation in which Ukraine is imperiled. My best guess is that's not going to happen, in part because I think Trump doesn't want to go down in history as the American president who lost Ukraine. And he does seem to have pivoted over the last month or two to a more sober and realistic assessment of Putin's aims. So I don't think that's where we're going to land, but that is certainly in the realm of the possible and the worst case scenario.
Charles and Yaroslav, thank you for the conversation. Good to have you with us.
Good to be with you.
Thank you both. Charles Kupchan there, who was Senior Director for the National Security Council under President Obama, and Yaroslav Trofimov, Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent for the Wall Street Journal.